this recognition that we are increasingly a state of contradictions and not one that has prioritized an ideal of shared prosperity. And we know some of the statistics. We know that California has the fourth largest economy in the world, and yet we have the highest poverty rate of any state when you take into account cost of living. We know that we have more billionaires than any country in the world aside from the United States and China, and yet 4.5 million Californians live below the poverty line. And this is a consequence of policy choices that we've made in both our distant and recent past that have led to this concentration of wealth rather than, again, moving towards a state with shared prosperity. And these choices have certainly trickled down towards our safety net systems as well. We've created barriers to access for programs like CalWORKs, where we see an uptake rate that's around 60%. And though it's sort of fluctuated over recent decades, we still know that regardless of that, what that means is that there are hundreds of thousands of families in the state that are not availing themselves of the resources that are vitally needed for them to get themselves out of poverty. So why is this? Well, why have we created so many barriers to access? Well, Epic's theory is that the reason behind this is that we have been internalizing as a society narratives and harmful stereotypes over the last decade, if not centuries, that further this notion that poverty is fundamentally an individual failing, that people live in poverty because they choose to be, because they're lazy, because they can't be trusted, or any number of other stereotypes that are very harmful and often quite racially coded. So what this leads to is benefits programs that internalize that belief and then structure themselves accordingly. They operate from a presumption of fraud or unworthiness that applicants themselves are tasked with disproving. And we see this through a number of examples. We see it through onerous or certification requirements. We see it through short durations of eligibility where applicants and beneficiaries constantly have to reprove their deservedness. And we see it through rigid work requirements that prioritize notions that we think are a little bit outdated and exist more from the 90s era welfare reform era, to instead of having one that's more flexible and actually prioritizes delivery of benefits. And the effect here is that it makes benefits harder to access, it ultimately discourages uptake, and fundamentally it breeds a distrust in government. So what types of reforms should we embrace? Well, I think fundamentally we need to abandon, again, this presumption of fraud that shapes so many of our systems, and instead prioritize the delivery of benefits over the gatekeeping of benefits. The status quo, again, places this burden on applicants to navigate an admittedly very complex system and time again prove their deservedness.